March 17, 1968. San Francisco, California. 7:42 in the evening. A thin coastal fog drifted between the street lamps outside Grant Avenue, softening the neon reflections that shimmered across rain-dark pavement. The air carried the faint mingling scents of sea salt and roasted garlic, a familiar fragrance in the city's Chinatown district where restaurants glowed like lanterns against the dusk. Inside one modest dining hall, lacquered wooden panels reflected warm amber light from hanging paper shades, and porcelain cups chimed gently each time they met their saucers. The room breathed with the subdued rhythm of cutlery, quiet laughter, and the low hum of Mandarin conversation drifting between tables. At the far end of the room, beneath a framed landscape painting of mist-covered mountains, sat Bruce Lee. He was not surrounded by admirers, nor positioned for attention. He occupied a simple two-seat table against the wall, angled slightly away from the center of the hall, as if deliberately choosing the periphery rather than the spotlight. Steam rose from a bowl of noodle soup before him, curling upward in delicate ribbons that dissolved into the lantern light. His posture was relaxed yet upright, shoulders balanced, eyes observant but unintrusive. He ate slowly, almost meditatively, each movement economical and unhurried, as though the act of dining itself were another form of discipline. The restaurant was neither grand nor obscure. It was the kind of place frequented by clerks finishing their shifts, families celebrating small occasions, and travelers seeking warmth against the ocean wind. The floorboards bore the softened polish of countless footsteps, and the faint scent of jasmine tea lingered permanently in the air, embedded into the wood and fabric over years of quiet evenings. A ceiling fan rotated lazily above, stirring the air just enough to keep the lantern flames steady but alive. Outside, a cable car bell echoed faintly from a distant intersection, its metallic ring softened by fog before fading into the urban hush. No one in the room raised their voice. Conversations remained courteous, measured, and respectful of shared space. The clink of ceramic bowls created a gentle cadence that seemed almost rehearsed. A waitress moved between tables with fluid efficiency, her black shoes whispering across the floor. Somewhere near the kitchen, a wok ignited briefly, sending a brief flare of orange light against stainless steel before subsiding into a controlled sizzle. The atmosphere was neither festive nor solemn. It existed in a balanced middle ground, a fragile equilibrium of routine and comfort. At his table he appeared smaller than the legend he would become, dressed in a simple dark jacket, sleeves neatly aligned at the wrist. His hands were lean, veins lightly visible beneath the skin, fingers precise in their motion as he lifted chopsticks with effortless control. His gaze occasionally lifted, not searching for recognition, but absorbing detail. The arrangement of chairs, the rhythm of footsteps, the subtle shifts in tone when laughter erupted and then quickly softened again. It was the awareness of a man accustomed to observing environments before entering them, even when no confrontation existed. Even in stillness, there was attentiveness. A glass window near the entrance revealed silhouettes passing beneath the streetlights outside. The fog thickened, curling along the edges of the glass like pale smoke. Each time the door opened, a gentle chime announced the arrival or departure of a patron, followed by a brief intrusion of cold air that carried distant city sounds before the warmth reclaimed the room. The world beyond those doors felt louder, faster, and less forgiving. Inside, time moved differently, slower, deliberate, insulated from urgency. Two businessmen at a nearby table discussed shipping schedules in hushed tones, their fingers tracing imaginary routes across the grain of the table. A young couple shared a pot of tea, their conversation punctuated by soft laughter that never rose above courtesy. Near the counter, an elderly man unfolded a newspaper with careful precision, the rustle of pages blending seamlessly into the ambient rhythm. Each person existed within their own contained sphere, intersecting only through shared air and muted sound. The lighting cast gentle shadows that softened every edge, Reflections shimmered across glazed plates, and the polished wood surfaces mirrored fragments of movement, an elbow lifting, a head turning, a hand reaching for a teacup. Nothing abrupt occurred. Nothing demanded attention. The restaurant existed as a sanctuary of ordinary existence, a place where anonymity was the default and recognition unnecessary. He finished a sip of tea and placed the cup down without sound. The gesture was subtle, yet it carried a precision that suggested years of intentional practice. There was no excess in his movement, no wasted energy. Even in such a mundane act, there was restraint and economy, an unspoken philosophy manifesting through behavior rather than words. To the casual observer, he was merely another patron enjoying a quiet meal at the end of the day. To those more perceptive, there was a composed gravity about him, an equilibrium that seemed resistant to disturbance. Beyond the kitchen doors, a chef's laughter briefly broke the steady ambiance before fading into the hiss of cooking oil. The scent of ginger and scallions drifted outward, wrapping itself around the dining area like an invisible veil. Outside, the fog pressed closer against the windows, blurring the city into indistinct halos of light. The restaurant became an island, self-contained, gently illuminated, suspended between the outside world and the intimate rituals unfolding within its walls. No cameras were present. No reporters lingered nearby. There were no autograph seekers or whispered recognitions traveling from table to table. The evening carried the anonymity of countless other evenings, indistinguishable in its simplicity. The calm felt permanent, as though nothing could fracture its balance. Yet beneath that calm, invisible currents moved subtle shifts in atmosphere that often precede moments history never formally records, but memory refuses to release. The door chime rang once more, slightly louder this time, its metallic note lingering a fraction longer in the air. A draft followed, colder than before, brushing against the lantern flames and causing them to flicker. Several heads turned instinctively toward the entrance. Not out of alarm, but mild curiosity. The equilibrium trembled almost imperceptibly, like the surface of still water touched by a single falling leaf. At the quiet table against the wall, he did not immediately look up. His chopsticks remained poised for a moment above the bowl, suspended in calm deliberation. The room continued its gentle rhythm, unaware that within the next breaths, the ordinary would be interrupted, and the quiet sanctuary would become the stage for a story destined to travel not through headlines, but through whispers carried from one generation to the next. The man who entered did not slip quietly into the room. His arrival carried mass before it carried sound. The wooden door closed behind him with a dull thud that seemed heavier than necessary, and the subtle draft that followed displaced the warm air like an unseen wave. Conversations faltered, not silenced entirely, but bent, as reeds yield to a passing current. He stood just inside the threshold for a brief moment, surveying the dining hall with an expression that blended impatience and entitlement, as though the space itself had inconvenienced him by not rearranging to his proportions. He was broad across the shoulders, his coat stretched taut along the seams, fabric pulled tight over arms thick with muscle. The floorboards answered each step with a deeper creak than they had offered any other patron that evening. At well over 200 pounds, his presence altered the geometry of the room. Chairs seemed smaller near him, tables more fragile, the air itself compressed. A faint scent of leather and cold night air followed in his wake, mingling sharply with the gentle aromas of tea and broth. He removed his gloves slowly, fingers thick and deliberate, each movement radiating an unspoken assurance of physical dominance. Several diners glanced up and then quickly returned their attention to their plates, instinctively retreating into their own spheres. Authority, when worn with confidence, often requires no announcement. It is recognized in posture, in gait, in the subtle widening of space around the individual who carries it. He chose a table near the center, one that granted him an unobstructed view of the room, and lowered himself into the chair with a controlled drop that caused the legs to groan briefly against the wood. For a few minutes, nothing fractured the calm beyond his conspicuous size. While he signaled the waitress with a curt lift of 2 fingers, ordered without pleasantry, and leaned back with arms crossed, scanning the hall with the detached boredom of a man accustomed to being the largest figure in any space he occupied. Yet dominance unchallenged often searches unconsciously for contrast, for a smaller object against which to define itself. His gaze eventually settled on the quiet table against the wall. There was a pause, barely perceptible, but present. The contrast was immediate. Where he was expansive, the other figure was compact. Where his posture declared occupation, the other's suggested control. The wrestler's lips curved into a faint smirk, the kind born not of humor, but of dismissal. He rose again before his meal had even arrived, chair scraping lightly against the floor, and crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps that drew subtle attention from nearby tables. He stopped beside the wall table, casting a shadow that swallowed the warm lantern light for a brief instant. Those closest pretended not to listen, yet their silence sharpened. The room did not freeze. It thinned. Sound receded to the edges, leaving the center momentarily hollow. "You're too small to fight," he said, his voice low but resonant, the words shaped with casual certainty rather than overt aggression. It was not a shouted insult. It was spoken as one might state a measurement, an observation delivered without the need for proof. The sentence hung in the air, heavier than its syllables deserved, because it carried the weight of physical comparison, the unspoken belief that mass equaled outcome. The seated man looked up slowly, not startled, not offended. His expression remained composed, almost curious, as if examining a statement rather than reacting to a challenge. He placed his chopsticks parallel upon the bowl's rim with precise alignment before responding. His voice, when it emerged, was calm and measured, devoid of heat. "Size is a surface," he said quietly. "Control is beneath it." The wrestler exhaled through his nose, a short breath that bordered on a scoff. He leaned closer, forearms resting on the edge of the table, muscles flexing unconsciously as if the very act of proximity were a demonstration. "Strength decides," he replied, his tone steady but edged with confidence, honed through countless physical victories. Around them, a teacup met its saucer with a faint clink that sounded louder than it should have, the smallest noise magnified by collective attention. "Your strength reveals itself," came the answer, equally soft, "but it does not always decide." There was no hostility in the exchange, only opposing philosophies condensed into a handful of words. One spoke from the certainty of visible power, the other from the assurance of invisible mastery. The tension did not erupt. It coiled, tight, silent, waiting. The lantern light flickered slightly above them, shadows shifting across the lacquered walls like the slow movement of clouds before a storm. The wrestler straightened, rolling his shoulders once as though preparing for a demonstration no one had formally requested. His confidence was not cruel, it was habitual. In his world, size had answered questions before they were fully asked. Yet in the stillness that followed, something subtle shifted. The seated man rose, not abruptly, not theatrically, but with fluid economy. The motion was so controlled it seemed less like standing and more like unfolding. For a fraction of a second, both figures faced one another in silence, the disparity in mass unmistakable, the disparity in composure equally undeniable. The room inhaled collectively, though no breath was heard. Plates cooled. Conversations dissolved into memory. Even the kitchen's sizzle seemed to retreat behind invisible doors. What followed occupied only seconds. No wide swings, no spectacle. A single, precise redirection of force. An arm guided, a balance displaced, a movement so efficient it resembled correction rather than conflict. The wrestler's momentum betrayed him, redirected with minimal exertion. His foot lost its anchor against the polished wood, and his frame shifted off-center. There was no crash, no violence, only the unmistakable sound of weight meeting floor in controlled inevitability. The action ended almost before it began. He stepped back immediately, posture relaxed, breathing unchanged, as though nothing more consequential had occurred than adjusting a misplaced chair. The wrestler remained still for a brief second, more stunned than hurt, his certainty interrupted not by pain, but by realization. The room, which had thinned into silence, now held that silence with reverence rather than tension. No applause followed, no cheers, only widened eyes, and the collective awareness that something undeniable had just unfolded without spectacle or cruelty. The lanterns above swayed gently, their light steady once more. In the space where arrogance had stood, humility began to take shape, not forced, and not humiliated, but awakened. The imbalance had not been exploited, it had been revealed, and in that revelation, the atmosphere of the restaurant transformed from curiosity to quiet awe, as though everyone present understood they had witnessed a principle made visible for the briefest of moments, before it returned to invisibility once again. For several heartbeats after the motion ended, no one moved. The restaurant did not erupt into noise. It surrendered to stillness. Steam continued to rise from unattended bowls, curling upward in thin, ghost-like strands. Indifferent to the shift that had just occurred, a porcelain spoon slid gently against the rim of a dish somewhere near the kitchen, its delicate ring sounding unnaturally loud in the suspended quiet. The lanterns overhead swayed almost imperceptibly, and their amber glow steady, as if the room itself refused to acknowledge anything extraordinary had happened. Yet every pair of eyes held the knowledge that it had. The wrestler drew a slow breath and pushed himself upright. There was no visible injury, no dramatic display of pain. What lingered on his face was not humiliation, but recalibration, the subtle expression of a man who had discovered that an assumption he had carried for years no longer held its weight. He adjusted his coat, smoothing the fabric across his shoulders, movements more deliberate now, stripped of the casual certainty that had accompanied his entrance. When his gaze lifted, it met calm rather than triumph. At the small table by the wall, Bruce Lee had already resumed his seat. He did not watch for approval. He did not scan the room for validation. His teacup rested precisely where he had left it, and he lifted it with the same measured composure as before, as if the intervening seconds had been no more significant than a passing draft from the door. There was no lingering tension in his shoulders, no accelerated breath. The equilibrium that had defined him earlier remained intact, untouched by the brief disruption. A waitress who had paused mid-step near the counter resumed her path, placing a dish onto a table with hands that trembled only slightly before steadying. Two businessmen who had frozen over their conversation lowered their voices even further, their words now little more than whispers dissolving into the air. The young couple near the window exchanged a glance that required no language. In that shared silence, legitimacy formed, not through cameras or proclamations, all but through collective witness. Nothing had been exaggerated, nothing embellished. The brevity of the moment granted it greater weight, like a single brushstroke completing a painting. The wrestler approached the table once more, but the air around him had changed. His posture was no longer expansive, it was grounded. He inclined his head, not deeply, not ceremoniously, but enough to acknowledge the exchange that had occurred beyond physicality. No apology was spoken. None was required. In the quiet between them, understanding replaced challenge. He turned and returned to his seat, the floorboards answering his steps with the same creak as before, though the sound now seemed lighter, as if some invisible burden had been set down. Minutes later, the rhythms of the restaurant returned. Chopsticks met bowls, teacups met saucers. Conversation carefully reassembled itself like porcelain, repaired without visible seams. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows, diffusing the city lights into pale halos that shimmered against the glass. The door chime rang again as patrons departed, each carrying the evening with them, not as spectacle, but as a private recollection that would surface later in quiet retellings. No photographs marked the incident. No headlines captured it the following morning. It did not enter official records or public archives. Instead, it traveled differently. It moved through memory, recounted over late dinners, mentioned in passing anecdotes, whispered in training halls and back rooms where respect for discipline outweighed fascination with fame. The details shifted slightly with each retelling, yet the essence remained untouched, a brief demonstration that revealed more than it displayed. Years passed, and the restaurant itself would change hands, its lanterns replaced, its walls repainted, its floorboards eventually renewed. Yet among those who had been present, the scene endured with unusual clarity. The angle of the light, the sound of porcelain, the measured tone of two opposing beliefs meeting for an instant before separating again. Some would later pause when passing that block, unable to explain why the air felt faintly heavier there, as though echoes could settle into brick and timber the way fragrance settles into cloth. What remained was not the image of a fall, nor the contrast of size. And what endured was the impression of restraint, the realization that true command often appears without announcement and departs without applause. In a world that frequently equates volume with authority, the quietest demonstrations sometimes leave the longest shadows. And so the story persisted, not carved into stone or printed on plaques, but carried in the subtle currency of human recollection. It lived in the spaces between words, in the knowing nod of those who valued precision over display. Long after the evening dissolved into history's unmarked hours, one truth continued to surface whenever the tale was told. Power that seeks recognition is easily measured, but power that remains composed becomes immeasurable.